we're being asked to believe that Donald Trump cares about Russian expansion, whereas he doesn't seem to mind Russia invading Europe. So why would he care about Russia invading a different part of the North Atlantic?
Hello and welcome to Whatever Floats Your Vote. I'm Nick, a TV producer aiming for the effective communication of accurate information.
My name's Phil. I like talking about politics.
Which is exactly what we're going to do. This is a podcast that explains politics so you can understand it and then explain it to others. And that's it. In this episode, we're turning our focus to United States President Donald Trump, and in particular his apparent aim to gain control of Greenland within the next 3 years before he completes his second term in office. So, Phil, over to you.
Right, so it's difficult to know exactly where to start here. Obviously, in order for European leaders to persuade Trump that this would be a stunningly bad idea for everyone involved, they have to know what he really wants. And there are several things he could know that he could really want. Like, why does he want Greenland? Some people think the answer is obvious. It's not that obvious. There's several possible reasons. We could start with the reason that Donald Trump himself gives, which is security. His argument is that Russia and China would want to occupy Greenland, which I'm sure they would if they had the chance, and that Denmark cannot defend Greenland against Russia and China. Only the United States can. And that's why the United States must own Greenland. But this rationale falls on a number of areas. The first of which is that Denmark doesn't strictly need to defend Greenland. It's a NATO, it's a NATO member. So it is for NATO to defend it, just like it's supposed to be for NATO to provide the collective defense of all NATO countries. The United States has a base on Greenland. It had many more during the Cold War. It can reopen them if it wants. Whatever Donald Trump will put on Greenland by way of defending against the machinations of Russia or China, he is free to do right now. There is no problem with that at all. Another issue is that arguably European powers, at any rate, probably could defend Greenland, at least in the foreseeable future. Russia is in no fit state to launch another incursion anywhere. It's bogged down in Ukraine. Even if at some point that resolves itself in some sort of ceasefire, Russia will have several years needed to rebuild before it can attack anywhere else. And Greenland is not an obvious place to attack. He would have to launch an armada across the rest of Europe, with the rest of Europe thinking, should we sink those ships before it gets to Greenland? Do you know what I mean? It's not easy to just... When Russia wanted to invade Ukraine, it amassed on the Russian side of the border for quite some time, with everyone going, oh no, they're just doing exercises, they won't really invade. You can't really do that around Greenland, in the icy waters around Greenland. If a large Russian fleet headed towards Greenland, it'd be fairly obvious what it was doing. And the other thing as well, this line of thinking from Trump, this idea that he needs to own it to secure it, which he doesn't. He can secure it as a fellow NATO member. European forces could arguably defend it against Russia given its location, but also, and Canada, of course, Canada would have every incentive to want to get involved in the defense against Russia.
Yeah.
But also, we're being asked to believe that Donald Trump cares about Russian expansion, whereas he doesn't seem to mind Russia invading Europe. So why would he care about Russia invading a different part of the North Atlantic if he doesn't care about what it does in... Because he's said in the past as well, it's not just about Ukraine. He said he doesn't care about Russia invading even NATO members if he doesn't think those NATO members are coughing up enough reddies. So the security one, it's not that you would instantly dismiss it, but it's unlikely to be the reason. The problem is at the moment, as we're doing this, it's probably a couple of days
Phil,
before this goes out.
We've covered we've covered Russia, and obviously Russia is weakened. I mean, you just look at Russia used to be able to step in. I'm sure part of the reason Assad fell in Syria was because Russia just couldn't prop him up like they used to.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely. I think it's almost inarguable that Russia has no capacity at the moment because it's so caught up in Ukraine. How about China, Phil? Would China have interest in Greenland, and why?
China would love to occupy Greenland, I have no doubt, but would China love to invade Greenland? I cannot imagine it. First of all, the routes to doing so would be even more obviously telegraphed than Russia's. And also, China hasn't, to be fair, China hasn't actually invaded anyone. They would the issue for them is Taiwan. They would like to take Taiwan. They haven't even done that yet. That would be their first priority. What would they do in Greenland? What could they seriously do in Greenland? If they could occupy it and no one would eject them out, that's fine. But they know that's unlikely. No one wants China in Greenland that is on either side of Greenland. North America, the Canadian and US governments wouldn't stand for it. The European governments wouldn't stand for it. So that would actually be a good way to unite NATO if China were to make a move for it.
Yeah.
And China hasn't made a move for. It's much easier for them to invade Taiwan than it is Greenland, and they haven't even done that yet. When they recently also said, regarding Iran and Venezuela, that force is never acceptable. You should not use force against another state. So in other words, they're backing up the UN Charter paragraph, chapter 2. But and then you think to yourself, but they do want to invade Taiwan. How do they reconcile that? They reconcile it by they don't regard Taiwan as an international issue.
Yes.
So there's no reason to believe that Taiwan would actively invade anyone that is miles away from China. And you think about the naval route required for China to launch an invasion fleet there, because it wouldn't just have to quell 56,000 people in Greenland. They know that would, that's the purpose for NATO. Someone outside NATO attacks NATO territory, NATO defends it. And this is something that even Trump would do. China, and that would destroy the world economy, an actual war, direct war between China and the United States. So I would completely reject that idea. Russia is much more reckless than China.
But
I just don't think Russia has the capacity.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, the US already has bases there. The military argument is a tough one to justify, really, isn't it? So where do we go from there?
Well, the other one, the reason why, the main reason I think, there is another reason on top of this as well, but the main reason I think is it's simply this: rare earth metals. As the ice has pulled away, it's revealed large deposits of rare earths in Greenland. And if you think about the geopolitics here, so in terms of the powers of the world, and we're going to have to discuss polar, monopolar and multipolar worlds here. We had a monopolar world. We're about to move to a multipolar world. Where are those poles? So in trade terms, the most powerful blocks are the United States, China, and the European Union.
Phil, just break down those two phrases for me, will you? And for our listeners, monopolar and multipolar.
So in a world, there's a hierarchy, there's a power structure. The rules-based order was supposed to create a world of nations who could do their own thing. They shouldn't invade their neighbors shouldn't invade them. We're going to be a world of international laws where every country has a sovereign right to run its own affairs. But in reality, that's not how the world works. The humans are tribal and hierarchical. So in reality, there are powers, and those powers will use their influence for their own benefit to persuade others by fair means or foul to do what they want. So in reality, in the post-war period, right up until the start of last year, America was the dominant power. So even though China and the EU had a lot of economic clout, and Russia has a lot of military clout, America was the undisputed power. It had the largest economy. It holds the world's reserve currency. It has the most powerful military. It's the most dominant culture. You've got American food, you've got American film and television, American music all over the world. America was the dominant power in what was a monopolar world. And Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, has decided that apparently making America great means moving from the monopolar world where America was the undisputed king to a multipolar world where by definition it can't be. But in his mind, the way he wants the world to be is to split up into spheres of influence. It's like he's saying, I don't care about the whole world, but I want to not ally with this hemisphere or this part of the world, but to dominate it. And that comes through in the national security strategy that was published, I think it was in November last year.
Yes.
So a multipolar world is one where you don't have America dominating the world. You have America dominating part of the world, and you have other spheres of influence. Now, at the moment, you would imagine you would end up with a bipolar world where it would be the United States dominating what it sees as its hemisphere, and China, a China-Russian axis, but China is very much the senior partner there, dominating its own. But the EU could become a pole in a tripolar world.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that, it can't accidentally fall into being a third pole. It would have to develop its own strategic aim to do so. And that strategic aim would have to openly accept that it is no longer allied with America.
And surely that would bring in military alliance as well, and an EU army, would it, of sorts?
I would argue you might already need it. I would argue at this point, you could make the case that NATO is already finished, because NATO, the whole concept of NATO is it's a defensive force. And if one member is attacked, all members are attacked, all members defend it. But the question going back some time now, going back to Trump's first term, was if a NATO member was attacked, would the United States defend it? People weren't very sure. And if the United States will not act to defend it, at that point, what is the point of NATO? You might as well just relegate NATO to being literally the North Atlantic and have a European force, because most of the threat is to the land continent of Europe. So it could be argued that rather than relying on the United States, because all it takes is for Russia. At the moment, Russia isn't sure, because otherwise Russia would not be making a big deal of Ukraine possibly joining NATO. That's one of their red lines. Ukraine mustn't join NATO. Why would Russia care if it doesn't believe that the United States would defend an invaded NATO ally? At which point you've got other NATO countries in the frame for an invasion later on as well. So
are you saying do you think that Putin does think that the US would step in? Right.
I think he's not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he was confident that the United States would not defend a NATO country attacked by Russia, he wouldn't care if Ukraine joined. It wouldn't be one of his red lines. He wouldn't care.
No.
I think Peter would be more than happy to describe NATO as a busted flush week, a relic of the past. He'd love to publicly say that. I just don't know that he fully believes it. He may believe that Trump isn't interested, but again, can he be sure? Where are the red lines for Republicans in Congress? Because they are the ones who are supposed to authorize military expeditions. They could order the US military to defend, say, Finland or Moldova. If they're attacked, they could order them to defend Ukraine, but they never did.
Yes,
so they have that power.
I suppose the point about if you were to break the world up into this tripolar arrangement that you just discussed, it would be very easy for the EU to have its own army, and if it sided with America, for that to those two sides to join up incredibly easily anyway. So the new world order, if you want to call it that, would essentially, it would probably take quite, and bearing in mind we're probably talking long term. Trump isn't going to be around forever. Who knows what's next? But if you're talking about disbanding NATO and then a democratic president does come in on the next go round, it's quite a big thing to break up NATO. However, if you did have an EU army and you had a friendly United States, it would probably still be. Would it be relatively seamless? Do you think,
No,
or not?
no,
Okay,
no. The only reason, even NATO struggles because it's multiple countries at once that have to coordinate, but they have to do lots of joint exercises to be able to provide any sort of seamless response to anything. So if you had a separate European army and a separate American army, they could be allied, but they wouldn't link up as easily because they wouldn't necessarily do joint exercises. They could do joint exercises.
They could. I suppose that's the point. It depends on who's in charge, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, if you've got a friendly United States, then you would pretty much link up anyway,
but there would be no common command structure. Like, for example, Russia, China, and Iran have carried out recently joint military exercises off South Africa. But they don't. But that is three separate powers just
without
linking
central
up.
command.
But that's not as centralized as NATO.
Yes. Okay.
And the issue with NATO, however, is because America is by far and away the most powerful member, it is always given the command role. The Secretary General isn't American, he's Dutch at the moment, but that's a diplomatic role, really. The military command of NATO is always an American military officer because America is deemed to take the lead in this, which is why America got to take the lead in how we responded with Ukraine. Even though Ukraine's not a NATO member, Russia is still a threat to NATO countries. There are some NATO members that would have liked to have seen us defend Ukraine more robustly, but America took the lead on that.
Well, I mean, isn't part of the problem with NATO, and you could say the EU, and Russia is a very good example of this. Trump arrives back on the scene and claims to be taking decisive action on many of these. He's trying to do it with Iran at the moment. He's trying to be a world leader. He's saying he's creating peace here, there, and everywhere. There has been, from what I can work out, coalition of the willing, call it what you want. I haven't heard anyone come up with a plan other than words about how Europe, NATO, the EU, whoever it is going to stop this war in Ukraine. No one. There has been nothing to provide an alternative to what Trump is doing. So, I mean, it's quite hard to not to criticise Trump, but where is NATO? I mean, it's hard to argue for the strength of NATO and the EU leadership because there's nothing that they're coming with to suggest how we should be stopping Putin. Nothing at all.
That's because Europe's military would be strong enough combined to repel a Russian invasion. It could, for example, repel Russia from Ukraine. But in terms of strict power, Russia technically has a more powerful military than even the combined European military. And that you have to be careful about how you combine it as well, because it's individual countries, not all of whom are as hostile to Russia as others. So it is a difficult one. The reason is because Europe, the one thing Trump has said consistently for years, which is very valid, is Europe has leaned on America for defense, and it arguably shouldn't have done. But you could understand why they did, because the deal was, and it sounded like a great deal for both America and Europe. The deal was this, that America would provide the backbone for European defense against a much weaker Russia. Russia was much weaker than the Soviet Union was. In return for which, so that the advantage for European powers is that means they didn't have to spend as much on defense, which they can spend on other things, depending on the government. That could be other public services, more on public services or tax cuts, whatever you wanted to do. It just meant you had an easier time managing your economy if you don't have to spend it on defense. Defense spending at the end of the day ideally never needs to be used. It's most effective when it's a deterrent. So you're spending billions of euros or pounds or whatever on something you hope never to use. And America got a good deal out of it as well, because America got to lead. It was the leader. So often Europe, even on non-defense issues, non-security issues, on trade issues, would take America's lead. For example, one mistake arguably Trump made last year on trade, he's tried to start a trade war with the whole world. If his major beef with China, he actually could have worked with the EU and said, right, China has certain trade practices that we don't really like. We want you to join us in combating them. And the EU doesn't want to create a wedge with China, but it would have chosen the US over China if the US says, we want to do this, we want you on our side, or we will take. So Trump could have actually built up allies for his trade war against China and not humiliated himself quite so badly.
But isn't Trump trying to do that in a sort of slightly longer way anyway? Because he's trying to get... If the UK was to sign a trade deal with America, the problem is, and I work on another podcast on this, is that if we do a trade deal with America, we're going to have to accept American standards. So we're talking, hormone-fed beef, chlorinated chicken, all the things that we roundly rejected previously. Well, is it a non-starter if Trump can then put pressure on the EU to do the same in a way that you were just saying, I don't want you to trade with China, I want you to trade with us. But anyone who sides with America in a trade deal has to accept their standards, surely, otherwise the trade deal won't happen. So therefore, what's the point?
Most trade deals are very weak. They don't really do very much. You can have a trade deal that doesn't accept those lower standards. It's just that the United States will not sign such a trade deal. So the trade deal is not, but it is a non-starter because this is, that's not working with someone. That's subjugating them. That's telling them what they have to do. People don't really like that. So the UK,
but
for example, won't sign such a trade deal.
Do you not think so? Because,
no.
It's very Starmer is... I think that's the thing. It wouldn't, but I suppose to sign the full-blown trade deal would cause a huge fuss. But Starmer can use statutory instruments, can't he, to get this stuff done if he needs to?
No. Well, he can, but he can't. Labour's big thing, like the thing they're really throwing their shoulder behind, is improving the cost of living. One of the biggest issues of that is food prices. They know that. They say it all the time. And they are equally determined that the only way they can address food costs, because they know that food inflation is going to be a thing for long term just because of climate change. The only way to address it is the only lever they have. An American trade deal doesn't do it. An American trade deal will put trade on worse terms. The tariff deal, we supposedly got a good tariff deal, but our trade terms with America after it are worse than they were at the start of 2025. So the only way we can improve our trade is with the EU. And we have a deal with the EU, and that deal will be just shredded if we accept things like chlorinate, because it's all about risk. The only way we can get in the next couple of years easier trade with the EU is the checks. We're targeting the checks, get rid of the checks.
Yeah.
But the checks are based on risk. So in order to get the checks down to close to zero on a lot of these goods, we're aligning standards. We've already passed one bit of legislation, the Metrology Bill last year, Product Regulation and Metrology Act 2025 as it now is, because it was passed last year. And they're working on new legislation now for even more standards to be aligned. They wouldn't be doing all that. They wouldn't be putting all this time and effort in if they were even thinking of accepting the American trade deal on the terms Trump wants, because that would instantly shred this deal with the EU.
Yes. And I don't think there's enough
the trade deal with the
chlorine
chicken, hormone-fed beef is an absolute non-starter. It's not going to happen.
And you can't,
no circumstances.
And the two markets don't work with one another. You can't have an American trade deal and align with US with EU standards.
You can have a US trade deal. Doesn't have to be anything. A US trade deal can just
finance.
It can be on anything.
Yeah, sorry. When it comes to lower, you can't lower your standards for America while still maintaining high standards.
Not if you want low checks. Checks are based on risk. It's the risk of something that's not allowed in the single market getting into the single market. The greater the risk, the more checks you carry out.
Yes.
So if you want checks to be zero, the risk has to be assessed as close to zero.
But do you think that part of the reason why Trump is so critical of certain EU leaders and not of others, potentially with this great deal maker he, plays himself as, do you think that Trump is trying to influence the EU and European leaders that he has on side to lower standards as well, so that he can flood Europe with American product? And do you think he's trying to make us all deregulate, so that essentially American produce can flood into Europe and we will all lower our standards for free trade deals with America?
Yes, but his first step is to destroy the EU, because the EU will
Yes,
never do that. There will never
right,
be a majority in the EU Parliament that will ever vote for that. So
exactly.
even in Britain is, although Britain broadly regrets leaving, that's because of the damage it did to us. We were still always traditionally a fairly Eurosceptic country, member of the EU. And even in this country, we do not want lower standards. So around Europe in general, people do not want the lower standards. So the
Especially with
aim
food,
actually
because
is
you
to
put
break the
food
EU up.
into your body. So, I think that's the thing, is that when people understand what lowering standards actually means, with hormone-fed beef, for example, they don't want that on the shelves. But that level of detail really gets through. But to come back to the point you made about breaking up the EU, that's incredibly hostile. So if we're talking about a tripolar world, in the short term, we have a very outwardly aggressive America to Europe. So where would that leave Europe, sandwiched in the middle of this tripolar world, if you had a Russia, China on one side and a hostile America on the other? In terms of worst case scenario, what does that mean for Europe if there were to be
It means
a war?
well, it has to make this is why it has to make a decision really quite quickly. It doesn't want to. During the first Trump administration, there was huge alarm bells going off, and they just thought, we'll just contain him and hope he loses the election. He didn't. They just breathed a sigh of relief and went back to it. And now they're realizing actually the world is changing now. The world is changing. We are moving to this multipolar world. And it's not just because America might be invading Greenland. There's all sorts of things as well. America has withdrawn foreign aid from all over the world. That's a huge amount of soft power. Foreign aid is not an act of charity. It's a way of stabilizing parts of the world that are to your profit as a country. And it means that, because you make sure you publicize the fact that you are providing this money in these areas. So that gives you a lot of soft power in those countries. America withdrawing that funding doesn't remove the need for it. So China will just step in.
Mm.
So we're moving to a position where China is going to boost its influence. In fact, I was just reading some polling today from people all over the world in lots of different countries, and the majority of people in lots of countries, including Western aligned countries, Eastern aligned countries, believe that China is going to grow in influence over the next few years, because they're looking at the events that's happened last year. And it's not just that Trump is picking fights with his allies, that inevitably, because China is not, the China-Russian axis is strengthening, if anything, and the America-Europe axis is weakening. So even if the China-Russia axis wasn't strengthening, by default, that would be making them relatively stronger. But people can see what else is going on. It's not just militarily. It's in terms of foreign aid. It's in terms of, the trade tariffs are reorganizing supply lines. They're changing trade patterns, and they're causing people to diversify trade away from America. All of this is weakening America over time, and that's set in motion. So even if Congress flips to the Democrats later this year, even if Trump loses or MAGA loses the next presidential election to the Democrats, and there's somehow a peaceful transfer of power or some sort of transfer of power, and America sort of tries to get back on an even keel, too much will have changed already. Those supply chains are already moving. Once you've done that, it's a bit like with Brexit. If we rejoin the single market and customs union, if we rejoin the EU tomorrow, we wouldn't get back all the trade we lost. We would have to slowly try and rebuild, because those supply chains they've moved, they're gone, right? And someone's now got a reliable supplier. They're not going to change them again. So we would have to win, we would get an instant boost, but because we would just make the trade we already still have cheaper, but we would then have to win back custom. And the same with America. It would have to win back that custom, but it may well be that in a few years' time, that China-Russia axis has already solidified its by looking like a much more supportive partner. For example, one thing, Europe in particular, but Europe and America sort of, you would say, together, when they're trying to strike trade deals around the world, they emphasize certain things. I mean, America doesn't really agree on the standards of the products, but they do at least, or have at least, agreed on human rights. So there's usually human rights clauses. China aren't doing that. China is saying we'll strike a trade deal with you. We're not interested in your human rights. That's a matter for you. So China is going to look a lot more attractive as a trade partner, as a defense partner over the next few years. And no change of American government in a few years is going to be able to put things back to the way they were in 2024.
And China, I suppose, over this period of immense building in all sorts of ways, financially, militarily, has not been involved in all of the wars that the United States has been involved in. Since 2001, obviously, the United States has been pretty much constantly involved in very, very expensive wars, and that's surely taken its toll. So China's ability to just be
China looks stable. China looks like a stable partner.
Stable. Yeah, and it must have. Its stocks must be fully replenished, well, not even replenished. It hasn't fought any wars. China hasn't had much, to spend its money on, has it?
Though. That is a double-edged sword, because when you are not actively involved in wars, you're also not got battle-hardened troops.
Yeah.
So, yes, but at the same time, we're talking an increasingly technologically led war anyway. That may become less and less of an important factor over time. But at the moment, it is still important to have veterans, to have a viable ground invasion force at any rate. But again, as you move more towards technological warfare, that could count for less.
I suppose we know that Putin has done what he's done in Ukraine, and we know why Putin. You don't need to search very hard to understand why Putin has done that. Do you think there's any interest from either the United States? I mean, we started this talking about Trump potentially taking control of Greenland, but in terms of major invasions, do you think China has any interest, and do you think the United States has any interest in significantly increasing the land that it controls? Or do you think China is much more, and the United States are much more interested in control of trade?
No, Trump has made it clear, explicitly clear. He's actually quite honest, really, in many ways. He's made it, as long as you don't talk about the Epstein files, he's made it explicitly clear that he wishes to dominate. As far as he's concerned, America. This is what he said about the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it's a misreading of history. The Monroe Doctrine, put forward by President Monroe in the 19th century, was the opposite of Donald Trump's Monroe Doctrine, because that wasn't about it was interventionist, but it was remember, this was at a time where European empires were still a thing. So the Monroe Doctrine was really about protecting against imperialism, whereas the Monroe Doctrine is very much about Donald Trump not being the first king of America, but the first emperor of America. He absolutely wants to dominate. He said this. He said he should control everything. People should do what within his sphere of influence should do is exactly what he says. As far as he's concerned, Venezuela, Maduro would still be in place now if he just did what Trump wanted him to do. The next person who came in line did what he wanted them to do, so they're allowed to stay. It's the same regime in Venezuela. He hasn't initiated regime change.
No.
From his point of view, it was all very tidy. He would have been quite happy to let Maduro carry on as president if Maduro had just. And when Donald Trump was talking about this, he never told journalists what he'd told Maduro he wanted. He would just say, he knows what I want. So as far as he was concerned, he wouldn't give it to him, so he replaces him. That's how he sees the world, and he's really clear about that. That's how he sees everything. Everyone should do as he says, within his sphere of influence.
Within his sphere of influence, yeah, exactly. And I think he's trying to increase that sphere of influence then by looking at if you look at Europe and his criticism of the EU.
He thinks that is his sphere of influence.
Yeah.
Like America has already dominated Europe anyway. It was always the senior part. I mean, if you talk about axes, you've got Russia, China, but you've also had a European, American one. But America always took the lead on pretty much everything. You might get the odd individual European country that would stand up to what America was doing on a particular thing, but it was mostly muted criticism, if at all, apart from maybe the odd exception. So America already dominated anyway, but it just now wants to, instead of having overbearing influence, it wants direct control. It wants vassal states. It wants these, and that's the problem with going to Greenland. The issue is if Trump does, it's like, what are your choices? You've got a few choices. If Trump actually, after the winter, does launch a force, an expeditionary force to take, whether that's just to go there, take down all the Danish flags, put up the stars and stripes and just declare it's his, like he declared the Gulf of Mexico was now the Gulf of America. If he even does that, at that point, various European powers have a choice. They're already building up forces there. Denmark has built up forces there, but also Sweden, France, and Germany at least are contributing some forces for exercises. They're carrying out exercises, but it means that there's going to be military personnel stationed on Greenland after the winter. And if America does try to then take Greenland by force, one option is you shoot back. You actually shoot at American soldiers. That would be a big move. I don't quite know how America would react to that. And when I say America, I don't just mean the White House, but Capitol Hill as well. I don't know whether, because what do you do then? If American soldiers are coming back in body bags because the Danish soldiers have shot them, what do you do? Does Congress go, hang on, this is getting too serious now? Because if you actually have war between America and Europe, America's economy goes down the tubes for several reasons. First of all, they are reliant on trade with Europe. They're trying to dominate it, but they are reliant on it. They can't afford to be at war. Their own economy will go down the tube. The cost of living will skyrocket. Their own people will kick them out of office, right? The other problem then is the distraction may well give China the chance it thinks to take Taiwan. If it actually succeeds in taking Taiwan, then all of those chips at the American tech sector is dependent. So the American tech sector, you definitely do get an AI bubble burst then, no question about it, because Europe's a huge customer, right? That won't be the case. And also, they are dependent on those chips being produced in Taiwan, which you cannot produce anywhere else in the world. Nowhere else in the world can produce them. China would destroy those factories or take them for themselves. Either way, America's not getting them. So the US tech sector, which is at the moment propping up the US economy, gone.
Right.
So do they think this is getting too serious, and do they order the aggressive action against Green to stop? That makes Trump look incredibly weak, because he's basically been defeated, as he describes it, by 2 dog sleds. That's how he's described the Danish defence force.
But doesn't this just... Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, do they double down and say, well, hang on a minute, America's been attacked here. We aren't actually going to have to win this. This is a war. We have to win it. Neither is a good option.
No. But doesn't the Taiwan example just exemplify that Trump is just essentially a bully? Because surely, from what you've said, Taiwan and the chips element is so much more important to America than Greenland. So why is Trump not trying to, for example, take Taiwan, if that's much more valuable to him? And I'd imagine it's because he doesn't want to stand up to China in any real way.
He doesn't feel he needs to own Taiwan. He knows full well it's defended. America defends it.
Right.
Just like it can defend Greenland. And it's easier to defend Greenland. It's further away from the country that's most likely to invade it. And the country most likely to invade it is much weaker than China.
So any noise that was made by the Chinese to take Taiwan, Trump should surely be absolutely... there should be no he will be absolutely up in arms, you would expect.
Yes.
Or is Trump smarter than that? Because he knows that the fight he'd get back from the Chinese is going to be much more of a risk for him than anything he'd get back if he did the same in Greenland.
The problem with Trump is he's inconsistent with what he says. The danger, China invading Taiwan, the danger is that they do it as a miscalculation, that they do it when they think they've got a window of opportunity.
Right.
That isn't there, and that then creates a direct conflict between the United States and China. That's always the worry.
Wouldn't there be a conflict anyway? If China makes any move for Taiwan, isn't that a direct conflict for the reasons that you've just stated?
That's what I mean. But China may believe, all China has to believe is that it can successfully invade Taiwan and take out those chips factories, at which point Taiwan is no longer valuable to America. Can it do that before America responds? Because America doesn't have a seawall in the way. I mean, Taiwan has just recently carried out its own live fire exercises for invading Taiwan. It's carried out a practice invasion of Taiwan, not obviously going as far as landing on Taiwan.
China's carrying out live exercises.
So it's making it clear that it is preparing itself for an invasion of Taiwan. It's just its own calculation will be, how long would it take, and can we do that before America responds?
Right. But then
it could
surely
be a miscalculation. It could think it's ready, and then it turns out it's not, at which case you've triggered that war. Because America cannot allow Taiwan to fall. It's too dependent on those chips. That is Taiwan's biggest bargain. Otherwise, Taiwan would probably be screwed right now, because Trump doesn't care about, he doesn't understand the geopolitics. He doesn't understand how power actually works. And he doesn't care about people who are allied. There's no such thing as an ally for Trump.
No.
There are only people who will buy his stuff.
Right.
That's it. There are customers, and there are people who are not customers in his world.
Yes.
But the other thing, the more likely thing, so there is, we have gone all over the place here. I haven't even gone through all the possible reasons Trump might actually genuinely want to take over Greenland. I probably should just mention those really quickly.
When we chatted before, we did say this could go anywhere. Here we are.
There's two other things. Well, one of them we have sort of alluded to, which is that Trump is actually empire building. He's building a literal empire, not a colloquial, not a sort of metaphorical one, a literal empire where every government is really a governor. Like, how he joked about at the time Justin Trudeau would be the governor of Canada. In other words, that Canada would be a 51st state.
Yeah.
That's how he would like to see other governments, that they are actually just, they just exist to carry out the US's wishes. That they can run their own affairs as long as it doesn't interfere with US interests. But as soon as it does, the US says, no, you're not doing that. But the other reason is those critical minerals, because if you think about strategically, China has access to rare earths, and it's basically cornered the market on processing them, which is a very dirty business, which not a lot of people really want to do. It's very unpopular in the areas you do it. So China and Trump has been chastened by this. Last year, one of the ways in which China won the trade war with Trump was by cutting off access to those rare earths for America. Tech industry is utterly dependent on it. And China basically controls the world market pretty much. It has, over 3/4 of the world market rare earths. Europe now has supplies. They're exploiting rare earths in Sweden, and obviously they're in Greenland as well, which is at the moment, it's not part of the EU. Actually, there is talk in Germany of maybe inviting Greenland to rejoin the EU, even though Denmark is, Greenland isn't, because Greenland didn't want to be part of the single market because it wanted to control its own fisheries.
Right.
But nonetheless, so Greenland can sell those mineral rights to America, just like Trump has a mineral deal with Ukraine. There's nothing to stop America having them.
That's one of the options.
But he wants them to own them. At the moment, Europe has rare earths within its own territory. China has rare earths within its own territory. The United States of America doesn't. So there's
and if
that
you look at Venezuela and oil, surely the motivation for Trump is the same. He wouldn't be interested in Venezuela if it wasn't oil.
Yes.
Surely he wouldn't be interested in Greenland if there wasn't for the rare earths. And that is, he's got form on this. I mean, he wants to extract. He doesn't care about the climate. He just wants, drill baby drill. That philosophy of taking everything from the earth that is valuable and turning it into a dollar.
Yes. So that's why I think that is the most powerful motivation. So at the
That does make
moment,
sense.
like European powers are scrambling to show that they can defend Greenland. So they're basically attacking his security argument. But because I don't, and I'm pretty sure they don't either, don't really believe it's a security issue, that it's really a minerals issue. What they really need to do is get Trump to say, why don't you just negotiate a minerals deal with Greenland? Why don't you just do that? Just like they did with Ukraine. But there is a counter to that as well in terms of, is that a major factor? Because if America needs rare earths, and it does, it has a treaty now with Ukraine, but Trump doesn't care if Russia invades the whole of Ukraine. If Russia invaded the whole of Ukraine, America wouldn't have those. So there's a sense in which Trump is willing to sacrifice reliable supplies of rare earths in Ukraine. So is that really the reason he wants? So it's all very complicated, and I'm sure it is complicated by his relationship with Putin. But it is odd. You say the critical minerals has to be the key driving factor here, and I believe it is. But then you say, so why isn't he defending their supplies in Ukraine, which he already has? He has a deal for that. I'm sure he could easily get a deal with Greenland to exploit those mineral resources. This idea that he needs to own it. But again, this could just be part of his personality. He needs to own it because he is avaricious. That he personally, he has a sort of personality that he wants to own things rather than have, he'll have business partners, but he'd rather just take over their business. He'd rather just own it. So that way you don't have to come to agreement. You just dictate.
Yes.
So what do you do about that? I mean, we've already discussed the consequences of potentially shooting at American troops that try it. Another possibility, more likely, but also has problems, is economic sanctions. The EU, the UK wouldn't really be able to do much here, but the EU would be able to apply really very damaging sanctions against the US. The twin obvious problems with that is, first of all, as Trump has demonstrated, trade sanctions bites both ways. So it's easy to apply trade sanctions to a country where it's one-sided. So we can apply trade sanctions to Iran because Iran is far more dependent on exports to us than we are to them. So it doesn't hurt us, can hurt Iran.
Yeah.
Applying them to America where it's much more mutual, the trade, despite what Trump thinks is much more mutual, hurts equally both ways.
Yes.
But of course, the European population will expect it, because if you don't shoot back and you don't apply economic sanctions, your only other option is to do nothing, which basically means you look weak. And then there is not going to be a tripolar world. It will be a bipolar world where America decides whether it wants to be China's bitch or America's bitch.
Well, exactly. And I think the one thing that, experience shows, the one thing you don't do to Trump is roll over, because he won't respect you. Whereas any show of fight or might, Trump kind of respects that a bit. And it sounds like he's a bit of a flat track bully. If you just roll over, then that's
he will
exactly what Trump. Exactly. So that's just not an option.
But the problem with the sanctions, of course, is last year the EU had every excuse to, like, when Trump launched his trade war against them, applied they were sort of prepared to swallow 10% tariffs, but it ended up being significantly higher, and they're not happy about that. But they still sort of swallowed it, and they didn't have to. In the past, the EU have been used to taking on America. In both Bush Jr. and Trump in his first term tried it on, and the EU fired back and won. So why didn't they this time?
Well,
it's because of Ukraine.
Yes,
they are dependent upon America's, at the moment, it's fairly weak, but it's still better than nothing, support for Ukraine. So the same thing happens if they threaten economic sanctions or shoot Russian soldiers. What does that mean for American support in Ukraine? It's all of this is a huge hot mess caused because Europe did not see the writing on the wall before Trump. President Obama was sort of indicating even at that point that American and European geopolitical interests were not quite aligned. America was already seeing Europe as less of a focus than the Pacific. They were focusing on the Pacific, that they saw China as the bigger threat than Russia. As far as they were concerned, Russia was badly weakened. Economically, definitely. It's got a rubbish economy. Now, with Biden, that continued until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2022, at which point he went, hang on a minute, can't have this. But Trump doesn't have that attitude. So, but nonetheless, the writing was on the wall 10 years ago. Europe now, when you asked before about what Europe does about Ukraine, at the moment, it's playing for time. Europe now recognizes that it has to defend its own territory. It understands openly, it's been clear about this, there's going to come a point where it's going to have to do its own defense and not have any American support. But it has to build it up, and it will take, with concerted action, at least 10 years. And that's with concerted action. There isn't concerted action. For example, there's national self-interest playing out even now in terms of this building up of defense forces. That is going to slow us down. Other things that could slow us down are certain changes of government. You know, the French elections in 2027 could well bring in a government that doesn't see Russia as a threat. 2029 could see a UK government that doesn't see Russia as a threat. Mm-hmm. And these are the two of the three most powerful militaries in Europe. So, but that's the problem we're in. We have this situation where we've allowed ourselves to become weak because we thought we could rely on America. And now, not only can we not rely on America, America looks like an enemy, not an ally. So we're trying to talk about America as an ally, just it's like trying to browbeat everyone to believe in it. But America, after that national security strategy, is a threat. It's certainly a threat to liberal democracy in Europe. It wants the EU broken up so that then America can do what you were suggesting before. If the EU broke up, America doesn't have to take on the EU, which is not as large as America, but it's large enough to sting back. It will take on Germany. It will take on France. It will take on Poland. It will take on the Netherlands, all of which are individually weak enough to be bullied.
Of course. Yes, of course. And that's the whole argument for the EU, isn't it? Is that, and just as in a trading capacity as much as anything else, if you have 27, 28, 20, however many countries, bearing in mind who joins and who leaves, you have a huge mass of countries acting as one trading bloc with a massive amount of leverage. Whereas if you break that up, and that's America's always probably wanted that, haven't they? Because like you say, it means they can dominate, which is what America has historically liked to do since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, some American presidents are different. Some see Europe as powerful allies, and why wouldn't you want Europe to be powerful given that we are side by side on most issues?
Yeah.
Trump sees us as adversaries. I mean, the strength of the EU, for me, proved itself some years ago after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which Facebook were very much implicated in. And the EU Parliament wanted to talk to Mark Zuckerberg about the involvement, and he trotted along and answered questions. Congress wanted to talk to him, and he obviously did that because his company is based in America. He's not going to defy his national legislative body. So he trotted there. The UK Parliament told him to come so that he could answer questions as well. And he said, no, I'm not doing that. I'll send you one of my underlings instead.
Yeah.
And that's the power. The EU, and this is one thing that grates against Trump. It uses its economic power to set standards around the world. And Trump doesn't like that because a lot of American companies are now producing things to higher standards, even though they don't need to for their own market. Because if you're going to sell the same product you always design for the highest standard of the major markets you wish to sell to. Because you don't want different production lines if you can help it. It's expensive.
No, it's very expensive.
You prefer to produce one product. So if you want to sell that product in the EU, it's got to be made to EU standards, which naturally means the CE mark is a gold standard across the world. Because if you don't want to sell it to EU, fine. You just go to the next highest standard of the market you are going to sell it in. But that is how the EU has set global standards, not by being the most dominant trading bloc in the world, America is, but by being dominant enough and having higher standards, it can impose its standards on others.
And who do those standards benefit most? They benefit the customer, of course, which is us, which is every member of the public who buys any of the products that are available on that market. The EU has the highest standards, which, again, I don't think enough information has been passed on to the public about effectively enough, because people don't want lower standard food.
No.
Food's a great example.
It is, yeah.
Why on earth would you want food on your supermarket shelves which is potentially going to harm you?
And it
You
does
just
harm
wouldn't.
people in America. In
Yeah, look at the
America,
American health system.
even per capita, it's got a, but if you compare the population with Europe, it's not. The number of deaths due to things like, food poisoning from chicken and things like that is so far in excess of Europe collectively, and there the populations are more comparable.
Yeah.
So America does have much more serious food-related illnesses because of
And
its lower
obviously,
standards.
and America, who doesn't provide healthcare for its citizens, doesn't need to swallow up that cost, because essentially you have private healthcare companies sweeping in and billing people for being ill. Whereas in this country, if you have a population that's unwell, that essentially you have to foot the bill as a government, because the NHS has to attempt to cure those people or has long-term sick. So if you then incorporate American standards over into the United Kingdom, and you're going to make people sick with lower standard food, then the NHS bills go up and you have a less healthy population. And when the public understand this, no one is going to want this. As you said earlier, there's no way that you think Starmer would be able to get a free trade deal through with the Americans who would lower standards.
I don't think he wants
like
to anyway,
that.
because he's made it his mission to get these close ties with the EU, and he was Mr. Remainer as well.
Yeah.
But even if, because we know, he's taking opposite views. His government has policies that are the opposite of his own personal policies in some other areas. So if strategically he needed to, yes, he may well want the American trade deal, but he knows that that's fatal. It would be deeply unpopular, and it would prevent him getting food bills down for the next election. The cost of living is the government killer right now. It's all throughout the Western world, certainly, has been taking governments out. So he knows that, and the American trade deal will not reduce the cost of living, whereas the EU trade deal will. And also it will just, if you think farmers are mad now, could you imagine a US trade deal honing interview? They weren't very happy after Australia.
No, and I do another podcast with some farmers who are very, remain backing left-wing farmers, and they've been explaining to me the problems of the American trade deal, and it would be awful for the British public, but also they're concerned about British farms and the inheritance tax being there, so that American companies essentially can sweep in, huge corporations can sweep in, buy the land on the cheap, and then mass produce very low quality food. That's why one of the reasons they're so fearful of an American trade deal. But I think to come back to something that we were touching upon just now, which is something that I was thinking is, at what point do people in this country who are openly, the Brexit at any cost voters, I call them, they see the evidence that the economy is struggling, that people's, that we are worse off for leaving, in particular, the single market. At what point do you think British voters, do you think this uncertainty from America is actually good for the rejoin cause? Because it will make people realise that whatever way you look at it, we are part of the continent of Europe. And if we have a hostile America to one side and a hostile Russia and China to the other, in your own self-interest, at some point, do you think the current international climate is actually making it the case for rejoining the EU stronger, because people will realise that actually we do need to look closer to home, and that we are part of the European continent, and there should be unity in Europe as paramount for our own security and for our own, for every reason that we've discussed.
And I think it's inevitable that if people see a bullying America and are not bullying Europe, they would want us to be part of Europe, and they would understand that in this multipolar world, you would actively want the EU to not just carry on existing, but for us to be part of it and for it to be stronger. I think one thing that this year may do is make the case even for a European army, something the Brexiteers used as a stick to beat the EU with. But in actual fact, if NATO, it may be that NATO doesn't exist right now, other than as I described it earlier today as a sort of weekend at Bernie's type thing where you're sort of propping up America as if it's still part of the alliance, and actually it's gone, it's dead. And if America's not going to be part of it, Canada would still be part of it, but you'd be better off if you just split it up into maybe naval defense of the North Atlantic and land defense of Europe, and have a separate European army to defend Europe. I think the case will be made for that, because as soon as people start to think that Trump wouldn't really defend Finland, for example, if Finland were attacked, would America really defend Finland? Finland is well wary of Russia, and it's been well used to defending itself against invaders from all over. But it doesn't spend a huge amount on defense, so Trump could easily decide that Finland is not a committed enough member of NATO. And would he? So at the point at which I think people in Britain are thinking, hang on a minute, who's defending us here? It's not America. Maybe we think, but Europe would. So I think, as soon as you start getting people thinking about the case for maybe a European army and getting involved in European defence, it becomes more natural to think in terms of the EU as well. Anyway, quite apart from the cost of living issues.
Bearing in
but
mind,
the issue is there's no debate about this in the media.
No, and I don't know why anyone would be scared of joining an army that isn't going to ever attack you because it's your own army either. It seems quite.
But that's the thing. You sometimes get this like weird cognitive dissonance, like when, for example, the Conservatives will describe foreign court. They'll talk about foreign courts. It's like they're not foreign courts; they're international courts. You know, the European Court of Human Rights is not a foreign court because it's not foreign to us. No. It's part of the same collective. It's just like, you know, I could say to someone in Norfolk, for example, am I foreign to them? I'm living in Lincolnshire. Am I foreign to them? Well, no, because we're part of the same collective. Yeah. Well, we were part of the same collective with the European Court of Human Rights. We were part of the same collective with the European Court of Justice. We are still part of this collective when it comes to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. They're not foreign courts, they're international courts because we're part of them and we have judges sitting on them. There is a difference, but people have the same sort of thing here when they're thinking about Europe. But it is a madness to me that the people who will cry about sovereignty also want our AI rules decided by a foreign tech billionaire. They want our trade decided by a foreign president. You know, it's like you're supposed to be about making our own decisions, and yet they're up in arms about the government saying, no, we're going to arrange our trade in our interests, and we're going to enforce rules on, or at least some basic standards of AI use in our country as well, which is sovereignty. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a question. It's just quite a simple case of if it's going certain people's way, they'll agree with it, and if it's not, they won't.
So logic doesn't always work because of certain people's. Again, it's because part of the brain that's being triggered does not do logic.
But I suppose it's more that if something isn't actually affecting somebody personally, then they don't really care about it. Whereas if people in this country get to the point where they see America as a threat and realise that we actually might need to defend ourselves, then surely the argument is, well, you need a European army and people with them. It's only when people realise that it might affect themselves, that they go, oh yeah, actually, if that's going to affect me, no, I don't want that.
That's exactly it. I tell you the downside to this, again, thinking about the psychology of it. So that is absolutely true. And if people see it, they will think to themselves, right, we don't want to be a vassal state. So, Europe, we need to build Europe up and we need to be part of it. Downside is, in order to get to that point, you have to be fearful of invasion by Russia or America or whoever. At that point, that's where the people who are good at triggering the emotional centers jump in, and then the rational think, because the way the brain works, you've got the frontal cortex, which does all your clever thinking. That's your logical part of your brain, but it's very slow. And then you've got your amygdala, which is your fight and flight response, emotional response. That's the thing that when you hear a rustle in the bushes tells you, is that a saber-toothed tiger when we were evolving? Leg it. because you can't afford for the clever part of your brain to go, which is the best route out of here? Because then you're eaten. And the problem is when you're fearful, that's triggering the part of the brain that has to be dominant. It has to take over for survival purposes. And it's not rational and it's not logical. And it just, so
And
you'll
that's what a
then,
tweet
and
does,
that's why,
I'm
for
guessing.
example, the way the media works is by constantly putting people into a state of panic and fear so that you
Yes.
bypass any sort of critical thinking. So the danger here is you're sort of going from a position of fear to a position of logical consequence that we need to join with Europe, but that may not happen.
Right.
Because other people who want us to say, no, we need to huddle up to Mother America will be the ones getting the message out to the public.
Yes. And again, I think it's about ways of thinking. I think I've heard there are certain, I think probably Stephen Yaxley Lennon was one of them saying, along the lines of almost, we'd be happy for Trump to invade this country and remove our leadership.
These patriots,
these people are so worried about foreign invasions. Yeah. And they're actually saying they would like Trump to come and do to Venezuela what he did. To do to us what he did to Venezuela. So, yeah, it's very strange. Okay, well, Phil, we still don't know for certain why Trump might want to annex Greenland, but I think safe to say with Trump, one thing we do know about him is he's wildly unpredictable. It hasn't happened yet, and if it does, I think the potential for it's a very, very scary situation for the world, really, isn't it? But particularly for us in Europe.
Particularly for us in Europe. I mean, there's some parts of the world may be loving it. I mean, if they are already aligned with China and they're happy to be so, they may think it's a great old time. Well, look, now you know what it's like with the shoe on the other foot. But for people in Europe and America, it will do neither USA, Canada, Europe, it will do nobody any good, because you will be literally going from a world which America dominates to a world where America competes with China and Europe has to make a decision before it's too late. Does it break off as its own pole, or does it try to stick its head in the sand and then find itself it's not in a position to be a pole and has to then choose between America and China in terms of which sphere of influence it wants to be in? And it will have to choose America, and even a Trump America under that situation.
And bearing in mind Russia, if you look back to 2016 and all of Carol Cadwalader's incredible work uncovering potential Russian links in wanting Brexit, isn't this current situation with Trump being openly hostile to the EU, the breakup of the EU, Brexit, isn't this everything Putin's wanted now?
Yes.
He must be absolutely over the moon, isn't he?
Oh, he's delighted. Oh, do you know what he was saying today? Well, today as we were recording it anyway, he was going, oh, Denmark, they're taking the piss out of you. They should be talking to you like that. You should slap them down, is basically what he's been saying. He's not been doing it in a Norman wisdom accent, but but
that's how he talks.
That's pretty much the tone of what Russia's doing. They're basically saying, oh, these Europeans have been a bit ungrateful, aren't they? They've been a bit cheeky, disrespecting America. So, he's loving it. Putin's absolutely he was screwed a year ago, or just before the presidential elections, actually in 2024. He was completely screwed. If Kamala Harris had won the election, there was no way out. Putin would have just been looking for an exit ramp and struggling to find one. Whereas now he thinks he can go for quite a bit longer. Various people have different ideas on that, but he's certainly moved his economy to a war economy. He's got the population really shouldn't be putting up with the privations they're having to, but they are doing, because he's convinced them that it's an existential fight for their very country. So he's got the Russian public to swallow a lot more privations than they normally would. Like even Iran aren't suffering as much as some people in Russia, and they're not having it. They've had enough of it. So he's absolutely loving it. At the very least, he thinks that at some point this year, Europe has to choose to either go against America in terms of trade or in terms of military or both, or Europe has to look weak. Either one is a win for Russia.
Yeah.
Unless Europe can find some way to buy Trump off. They need to go and have words with Switzerland because they worked it out. They were given massive tariffs. Did you see what they did?
I can't remember.
They were hit with huge tariffs, so they gave Donald Trump an antique watch and a gold bar, and he let them off. And he reduced the tariffs to now below the level of the EU. The EU were not happy, but it's like, well, you should have given him the gold bar then.
I do remember that. Yeah,
just buy him off.
Wow.
Buy him off.
Buy him off. It's very, very easy. Okay, well, that's been fascinating as ever, Phil. I think, it leads to so many more questions and conversations, but I hope that gives everybody listening and watching a bit more of a clearer picture about where we might be. And as ever, thank you so much for listening and watching. And Phil, as ever, incredibly eye-opening, and hope that makes sense to everybody watching and listening. Thanks so much for doing so. And Phil, thank you.
Thank you very much.